Morning, afternoon, or evening, or wherever you are. Welcome to day three of the seminar series on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversities of areas beyond national jurisdiction, hosted by the One Ocean Hub. On today's agenda is area-based management tools, including marine protected areas and environmental impact assessments, as well as capacity building and transfer. The series on the BBNJ proposed treaty aims to achieve the following objectives. One, to enhance understanding on the purpose, history, and procedural aspects of the BBNJ negotiation process. Two, to improve awareness on issues being discussed during the negotiation. Three, to strengthen knowledge to better participate in informing the BBNJ negotiation. I am your moderator, Alana Lancaster, an environmental and energy lawyer specializing in the marine environment, based at the Faculty of Law at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus in Barbados. Before I begin, let's do some housekeeping. All sessions are set to auto-record, and we hope to share these via YouTube after the event. The images, audio, and any slides or videos shared by any panelist or speaker will be included. If you do not wish to be recorded, please let the organizers know or let the host know at the start. We will ensure not to include this in the YouTube materials. You may use the chat function to introduce yourselves, but questions should be posed in the Q&A function. Please indicate the name of the panel member they are directed to at the start of the question for ease of response. Please note that in today's session, our first presenter, Dr. Daniela Diz, unfortunately has to leave before the end of the session. So please pose your questions using the Q&A function, and we will ask these immediately after the response to the discutant. While the panel will endeavor to answer all questions in the session, but in the event that we run out of time, participants may contact panelists directly after the event or via the One Ocean Hub website or by email, or they can repeat their question in the post-event survey. I am sure that the panelists, if they are so inclined, would indicate if you can contact them further. Now, in terms of the format of today's presentation, every speaker will be delivered for 15 minutes, and each discutant will be allocated 5 minutes to state their comments and questions. Each speaker will be given 5 minutes to respond to the questions and comments made by the discussant. The panel presentation will then proceed with the Q&A. Join me in welcoming our speaker. So our first speaker, sorry, my video went off there. My first speaker is Dr. Daniela Diz of Heriot-Watt University, and she will discuss implementation of marine protected areas under the proposed BBNJ treaty. I welcome Dr. Diz. Dani?
Thanks, Alana. Thanks, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me try to share my screen. It worked before. There you go. Yeah, thanks, everybody. So I'm an associate professor at the Lyle Center of Heriot-Watt University, and I've been following the BBNJ negotiations for many years, over a decade now. So I'll be speaking about MPAs, marine protected areas under the BBNJ agreement. Just wanted to start with a paper that was released earlier this year in 2020 by Duarte et al. That had some very good, I think, hopeful messages for us in terms of, even though the marine environment is degraded and continues to be impacted by multiple pressures, there is hope. And the paper points to a number of policy instruments that, and legal instruments that contributed to a better scenario that we have today than otherwise we would have, and points to good practices in terms of conservation and management measures that led to good results in some cases. So looking to, I just wanted to start with a hopeful message that if the BBNJ agreement is strong enough and has enough implementation measures contained in its text, and also allow for an evolutionary interpretation like UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Convention, had, I think there is hope that we can reverse this trend of biodiversity laws, of marine biodiversity laws, and we can have a much more resilient oceans, productive oceans. That's something that will lead ultimately to the health of the planet and of the human beings as well. So just wanted to point to this, to these findings from the paper. Before starting to dive into the BBNJ agreement in itself and some of its provisions, what I'd like to touch upon today is some of the provisions in the draft revised version of the text that we have, that's being currently negotiated, of the BBNJ text. But before going to those details, I'd like just to remind us all of the purpose of the Law of the Sea Convention, since the BBNJ agreement is supposed to be an implementing agreement to the Law of the Sea Convention. And the purpose of the Law of the Sea Convention is to provide this legal order for the oceans and seas, to facilitate international communication, to promote peaceful uses of the seas and oceans and the equitable and efficient utilization of the resources, but also the conservation of the living resources and the study, protection, and preservation of the marine environment. So this is just, I think, good to keep in mind, because the BBNJ agreement is supposed to operationalize a number of the provisions. They're general in scope under the Law of the Sea Convention. One of those provisions, or some of these provisions that the agreement is supposed to operationalize, is the obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. And in Article 194, paragraph 5, it specifically talks about, oh, sorry, I pressed the button. It specifically talks about measures that should be adopted by states in cooperation with each other to protect and preserve rare or fragile ecosystems, as well as the habitat of depleted, threatened, or endangered species and other forms of marine life. And I interpret this article to include measures such as area-based management tools, not only area-based management tools, but that article includes that possibility of establishing area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. Of course, this article is not only, it's not only applicable in areas beyond national jurisdiction, but it's applicable in both areas within and beyond national jurisdiction. The one thing that I always mention is that, the Law of the Sea Convention, it has meeting of state parties, as you know, but it's more focused on administrative matters, and it doesn't really have conference of the parties where implementation measures could be further discussed or adopted under the convention. So it's really under the obligation to cooperate that states have in areas beyond national jurisdiction, that marine protected areas can be established and managed in areas beyond national jurisdiction. But of course, you need to have conventions in place, regional organizations in place, and cooperation among those competent organizations as well, in order to implement those measures in a coherent manner. So hence one of the needs for a new implementing agreement, in addition to the previous two that we have, one on deep seabed mining and the other one on straddling and highly migratory fish stocks, to operationalize those measures, those provisions. So I just wanted to remind us that there has been a lot of work done on marine protected areas under the Convention on Biological Diversity. And one of my key messages, and it's spoiler alert because it's already the conclusion of this presentation, but I wanted to also point to that in the beginning so we can think about that together, is how can we maximize the efforts already being undertaken under other conventions so that those synergies can be materialized under different conventions. The Law of the Sea Convention is supposed to be interpreted not in a vacuum, but also in accordance to other, with its relationship with other conventions and other instruments that help supplement its general provisions. And the Convention on Biological Diversity has a special relationship with the Law of the Sea Convention. Even its Article 22 talks about that relationship between the two conventions. And even though there is, of course, the jurisdictional scope of the CBD is limited somehow in areas beyond national jurisdiction, it's not applicable to marine genetic resources, for example, to the components of biodiversity per se. It's still applicable to activities and processes in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And a lot of the instruments developed and adopted under the CBD and processes undertaken could be useful to the BBNJ agreement. So that's my main message in this seminar today. So one, the CBD has already defined, it has a definition under its Convention of Protected Areas, but not specifically marine protected areas. There is a specific decision that was adopted in COP7 that refers to marine protected areas, and this is the definition that it provides. Even though it's in a footnote of that specific paragraph, but it has already defined. And when we go to the BBNJ negotiations, we see some of the same, roadblocks, discussions around definition being debated, and a lot of time spent on things that have already been agreed under other conventions. So that's one thing that I wanted to highlight. So going now, diving more in depth into the BBNJ process, I just put here, of course, I'm not going to talk about the history of the BBNJ negotiations here, but just to emphasize that when the PrepCom, the preparatory committee before the Intergovernmental Conference was established, so when the PrepCom was established, the resolution of the General Assembly that created the PrepCom stressed the need for the comprehensive global regime to better address conservation, sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. And this is what I wanted to highlight. This comprehensive global regime needs to incorporate those relationships between treaties and compatible and relevant instruments. And in this light, the legally binding agreement for the BBNJ agreement was discussed and agreed upon to be negotiated. Of course, the Intergovernmental Conference came about. I'm just trying to see a little bit because the screen is all mixed up here, my screen. It was the UNJ Resolution 72-49 of 2017 adopted the conference to elaborate the text of the agreement. And what I'm going to focus now is this revised draft text that was released in November last year. And that's what the IGC4, the fourth session of the Intergovernmental Conference, was supposed to be focusing its attention in March, April, but it didn't happen because of COVID, of course, and there has been some intersessional sessions online that have been discussing some of those issues, and eventually next year we'll have the actual IGC4, which is supposed to wrap up everything, hopefully, and agree on a text if things go well. So that revised text has a tentative definition of area-based management tools. And it talks about area-based management tool as a tool including a marine protected area for a geographically defined area through which one or several sectors or activities are managed with the aim of achieving particular conservation, sustainable use, objectives. So what is interesting to me is that there is still debate around that these area-based management tools will afford higher protection than in its surrounding areas. I find just that interesting. Of course, in the context of marine protected areas, that should be the case. In the context of other area-based management tools, it could vary, but it's just interesting to note that, the bracketed text is, this is still controversial. It shouldn't really be that controversial, in line with what we discussed before, in line with definitions under the CBD. One thing that I wanted to point out as well is the identification of areas. So how are we going to identify those areas that require protection, or how states, parties will identify areas that require protection? So what the text includes at the moment is an Annex 1 of the BBNJ text, which contains criteria, an indicative criteria. Of course, more could be included at a later stage. And I think this is a good idea to have this sort of annex. And the annex at the moment contains a number of different criteria taken from existing tools and in line with what I'm discussing here today, from different instruments already, existing instruments. So for example, you can see criteria there that's similar or equivalent to the CBD, ecologically or biologically significant marine areas. You can see criteria that's similar to vulnerable marine ecosystems under the FAO. You can see criteria that's similar to particularly sensitive sea areas under the IMO, and so on. So I think it's a good list to have, especially saying, in light of being an indicative list of criteria that could be updated as as the years go by COP, for example, or by other means, by the Conference of the Parties or other means. What is surprising to me is the number of brackets still contained in the annex, the square brackets, which means that, of course, I mean, the whole annex is in brackets, but also within the bracketed annex, there's still some elements that are controversial, and they're still in square brackets. I want to highlight here that I'm not being naive, and even the texts that are not in bracket, it doesn't mean that they have been accepted, and it's still nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. The text is being negotiated as a package, but it's I just want to highlight those bracketed texts and make a few observations. So I wanted to focus a little bit on something that's very important to me, because I've been following this process for many years as well, which is the ecologically or biologically significant marine areas under the Convention on Biological Diversity. The criteria that we see here and we saw in the annex of the BBNJ agreement, the draft text, this criteria of the CBD EBSA was adopted in 2009 under decision 9/20 in its Annex 1. And since then, since 2010, 2 years later, in the following Conference of the Parties, the CBD parties adopted a process for describing areas that meet the EBSA criteria. So far, over 300 areas that meet the criteria have been described in areas beyond national jurisdiction, as well as within national jurisdiction, with the consent of the coastal states if they wish to include their areas or not within the scope, the geographical scope of those technical and scientific workshops. The workshops identify those areas based on pure scientific information. There's no politics involved in the description of those areas. The only politics is whether or not a coastal state will allow the geographical scope of the workshop to be included in their waters or not, but that's a decision from the outset of the process. So it's, and it has been a very successful exercise under the CBD. And I must say that those areas are purely the identification of areas that are important for biodiversity. It doesn't mean anything in terms of management obligations or requirements. Of course, there's recommendations under the convention, under the COP decisions, that those areas could be, would be very useful if they were used for impact assessments, for example, for strategic environmental assessments, for marine spatial planning, but also for marine protected areas, but also for fisheries management measures and things like that. But MPAs are one tool that could benefit from the knowledge provided by that scientific information contained in the EPSA process, the EPSA polygons. The other very important process as well is the vulnerable marine ecosystems that started with UN General Assembly Resolution 621-105 from 2006, and the criteria for identification of VMEs was adopted later on by the FAO in its deep sea fisheries guidelines in 2008, and regional fisheries management organizations have been identifying those VMEs and imposing conservation management measures, including closures, fisheries closures to those areas. So you can see that the criteria for identification of those areas is somehow similar to the EPSAs, but different in the sense that this is really benthic ecosystems, and the EPSAs can include both benthic and pelagic ecosystems. So what is interesting to me is, you can see here, so this is going back to the EPSA criteria, that if you look at the annex of the BBNJ agreement, we can see those brackets, those square brackets of controversial, set of criteria under uniqueness or rarity, biological productivity, and naturalness. And it doesn't make sense for me, to me, it will be very difficult to use that information provided by the EPSA process if you dismember the criteria like that. If in the end, those three criteria are not included in the list of the BBNJ agreement, of course, it's an indicative list. They might come back later on and all of that, but if they're not included, it would be really difficult to use that information, those maps, for example, those polygons, for any recommendation around them. And that work is already conducted under the CBD, so it would be a waste not to capitalize on what's already done there, to then look into what you could do with those polygons in terms of area-based management tools, not only MPAs, but you could have a section of that. Of course, those polygons are massive. You could have a subset of that would need more strict protection through MPAs. I'm not saying here at all that all of those EPSAs should become high seas MPAs, but what I'm saying is that we should take advantage of that good work that has been done and capitalize on, build on that to have better decisions under the BBNJ agreement. So those other ones have made it to the list without brackets, even though the whole list is square brackets, keeping that in mind. But the other thing that is, somehow contained in the text of the BBNJ agreement, the draft text, but not, in a coherent fashion, is the need for ecologically representative MPA networks. And this criteria was also adopted by the same COP decision of the CBD that adopted the EPSA criteria, and looks into, I would even, under the BBNJ agreement, perhaps not only look into EPSAs as one of the first criterion, but EPSAs or other similar set of criteria that identifies areas important for biodiversity. And in addition to that, you would have to have representativity from a biogeographical perspective, connectivity, replication, and adequate and viable sites in terms of size as well. So we can see that, the need for connectivity has been emphasized a lot by a number of organizations, and there is a lot of good work being done under the Convention on Migratory Species as well. So I wanted to emphasize again the links that I think that the BBNJ agreement can build upon with CMS as well as with CBD to attain those objectives, not only creating MPAs individually or thinking of them individually, but thinking of them as a network, so that you can build a more resilient environment. So moving on to another issue that I find a little bit also controversial is the notion that in the draft Article 21, paragraph 4, it talks about the revocation of area-based management tools, including MPAs. So giving the impression that they would, and there is even a text there in square brackets as well, that they would automatically expire in some cases. And this is, MPAs usually they don't expire. I think that the notion has been, taken a lot from inspiration, perhaps from fisheries conservation management measures that sometimes once, for example, you have measures to rebuild the stock. Once the stock is rebuilt, then you can lift a moratorium, for example. So that's a different story. So I just wanted to contextualize here, or express my opinion, perhaps, that it's, I understand the need for adaptive management measures. And of course, in light also of climate change and ocean acidification, things need to be and management measures need to be more dynamic. But I think that having from the outset a specific text mentioning the expiration of MPAs, that they should be time bound, it could be a dangerous thing to be included in the text. And this comes, it reminds me of the Ross Sea MPA discussions in Antarctic, which, for it to be accepted, the 35-year expiration period was the compromise. But in achieving that, there were declarations made that wouldn't create a precedent for other areas of the world. And so I just hope that is not creating a precedent for the BBNJ agreement. And finally, the last point I wanted to make it with regards to MPAs is the decision-making process under the BBNJ agreement. The draft text contains two possible options for the establishment and management of those areas, and they're very very different, so very contrasting from each other. One would be kind of top down, the other one more bottom up, where the top down would be at the global level, the area is established, and the management measures would be pretty much almost like imposed upon the competent authorities to adopt. And the other option would be very soft, light touch, where the competent organizations responsible for their sectoral measures would simply implement general principles of the BBNJ agreement and so on. And I think that a middle ground, I think a good discussion on the decision-making is really needed amongst parties, and I'm hoping that this interlude that we're having now with online discussions and more time to think could provide that opportunity for parties to think better about what can make a difference and how can the BBNJ agreement actually help competent authorities achieve their mandates, rather than being perceived as one instrument against the other. The whole notion of non-undermining, instead of not looking into this agreement in terms of this agreement would undermine competent authorities, or competent authorities are undermining this agreement, but more as a means to operationalize the obligation of international cooperation. And I think this is should be the core of the discussions around decision making, so that we can have an inclusive participation and wide universal participation to the agreement, but also not only participation, but also a good comprehensive agreement that would deliver those obligations, those general obligations that we saw under UNCLOS before. So just to conclude, I already said what my conclusions are, but I believe that more synergies with the CBD, with CMS, and other conventions and instruments should be further explored to ensure that this global comprehensive regime under UNCLOS is materialized, and that could be achieved, I think, building on existing policies and work under these instruments, and looking to the gaps, and then providing meaningful means for operationalization of UNCLOS objectives and those other instruments objectives as well, regarding spatial protection and beyond. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Danny, for certainly a comprehensive, and I think you give us much to think about. I swiftly invite Dr. James Bell of CFAS UK to give his comments and questions, and when James is finished, I immediately have a question or two for you, Danny. Thank you.
Thanks, Alana. Thanks, Danny. I was asked to prepare some questions for Danny as someone who's sort of dimly aware of most of these things, but not an expert by any means. So, but I see we've got a question in the chat actually from Kerry Howell. I'll kick off with that one, I think. So, Danny, do you think this new BBNJ agreement is an attempt to bring all these strands together? EBSAs from the Convention on Biological Diversity, VME area closures from the regional fisheries management organizations, APEIs, the areas of particular environmental interest from ISA, and others, I guess.
I think ideally, yes. I think it would be really good. Of course, I don't want to give the impression that I think, it would be a single mandate of the BBNJ agreement to look after all of those things. I think those competent authorities, competent organizations would still have their very important function to identify those areas, to manage those areas and all of that. But I think stronger cooperation and synergies across those spatial tools would be needed, because sometimes we see the sectoral approach can undermine the overall objective of protect, conservation, and sustainable use of marine biodiversity. We can see areas of VMEs. VMEs are purely a fisheries tool, but you can have oil and gas on the top of them. You can, if you allow deep seabed mining to occur on them, it could, pose an impact. And I think the objective, if we were to achieve the objective of the BBNJ agreement of conservation, sustainable use, there is a need for a coherent approach, and it could serve as a platform for having those discussions and those agreements on what's the best way forward.
Thanks, Danny. Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. I mean, even just within the regional fisheries management organizations, there's not as much cooperation as you might think. So even just at a sectoral level, it doesn't work as well as it should, let alone between sectors. So that was a kind of very broad scale question, and I'm going to zoom right in now. We know that organizations like the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna do a variously good job of conserving the species that they're responsible for, and the other tuna RFMOs as well. To what extent does the proposed BBNJ instrument allow scope for conservation of specific species, say southern bluefin tuna, which are heavily exploited, and the kind of incumbent organization has really failed to kind of address that meaningfully?
Yeah, that's super controversial, James, and it's a great question because it also goes into the core of, what do we do with those species that, they're species, they're endangered species or threatened species, and they could be object of CITES or other conventions or CMS even, but they're also a living marine resource as they are qualified under UNCLOS, and they're the object, target species of regional fisheries management organizations. There had, in the beginning of the process, even when the BBNJ, it was an intergovernmental conference, it was still an ad hoc, open-ended working group tasked to study those issues. Fisheries has been a very, debated and controversial issue. It's at the moment it's excluded from the scope of the draft agreement. So management of fisheries per se is not something that's being looked at under the agreement. There might be other different views, but from my understanding, management of fisheries is not part of the scope of the agreement. But area-based management tools under the agreement will have implications for fisheries management. So it's that interface that's still being, needs to have more discussions and resolution. And I think it's around that decision making in the end. So that's, the crux of the problem, how we're going to ensure that those that the RFMOs are consulted, but at the same time that the measures that are imposed under the global level can trickle down to the RFMO. So it's still to be seen. I don't have an answer for that, but it's it's not, fisheries management is not the object of the agreement, but there will be implications, and that's
Okay, thanks, Danny. Yeah, that kind of leads quite nicely to the other question. Have I got time for one more, Alana?
Yes, one quick question since we have Danny, and then I'll.
Can't promise it's quick.
Yeah.
Okay, so the other last question I was going to ask was, so how could area-based management tools / MPAs be designed in such a way that they're ecologically coherent, but they don't disadvantage countries who can't range over the face of the earth to conduct their activities? So I'm thinking, example, in West Africa, there's a huge amount of tuna fishing that goes on. If you put a huge ABMT there, the distant water fleets from Japan or Spain or wherever would just move, and all of the small scale fisheries that also depend on that resource wouldn't be able to, because they would suddenly find themselves cut off.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it needs to be considered very seriously. Of course, the ABMT would be in areas beyond national jurisdiction, not within. So, but if it's right on the border there of the EEZ, and then that could displace the ships, the distant water fleets from the high seas and make them move to areas within national jurisdiction, they would have to negotiate, of course, bilateral fisheries agreements and other instruments with the national authorities. But we need to make sure that, the coastal states that have those vulnerable communities that depend on the resources need to be at the table and negotiating how that could be affected. But the other way around to think about that too is that perhaps, and that's something that I think we need to, there is a need, I think, in my view, for a scientific committee under the BBNJ agreement to look into those issues and look into the trade-offs as well when creating those, the design of the MPA networks, and to look into the consequences and the trade-offs. But there is another argument that you can say, well, actually, if the areas, adjacent areas of areas beyond national jurisdiction is closed, perhaps for fisheries, maybe, I don't know, but it would depend on, it's a case-by-case basis. You can have a spillover effect that could benefit the coastal state as well. But all of those things need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. And and I think that we need to have those, modelers and interdisciplinary team also included in those debates in the scientific committee. And I just thought of something. Sorry, I'm taking too much time. With regards to your tuna question, James, one thing that we might want to consider in these discussions is not necessarily, ABMTs, but I think how EIAs and strategic environmental assessments could provide a good instrument for an interface with the RFMOs, because at the moment, only bottom fisheries are required to provide impact assessments, and maybe that's something that could be complemented or supplemented through the BBNJ agreement, but of course it will depend on political will and a lot of negotiations. I'll stop here.
Cool. Thanks, Danny. Thanks, Alana.
Thank you, Danny and James. Pleasure to see you as always. And actually, Danny, you created the perfect segue to our next presenter. I'm quite pleased to introduce Mr. Khalil Hassan Ali, a PhD candidate at the World Maritime University, who will discuss environmental impact assessments under the proposed BBNJ treaty. And I'm particularly happy to be moderating while Khalil is presenting, as we're both from the same Caribbean region. Khalil, over to you.
Thanks, Alana. Hello, everyone. Let me just start by sharing my screen. And is it showing up now? Are we good to go?
Yes, please. Yeah, you can go.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. My name is Khalil, and as Alana said, I'm a PhD student at the World Maritime University, Sasakawa Global Ocean Institute, where I'm researching the BBNJ's agreements interrelationship with the Caribbean blue economy. I'm also a negotiator for the Caribbean community, or CARICOM, on the EIA section of the BBNJ agreement. So while I'm presenting here in my personal capacity, for those of you who have been following the negotiations, you may find that what I present is closely related to the CARICOM position. Today I'm going to talk a bit about internationalization of the EIA process under the BBNJ agreement. So in the draft text of the BBNJ agreement, part 4 deals with environmental impact assessments. The EIA section is by far the largest, the longest section of the draft agreement, with a whopping 21 articles. The articles and what they address are listed here on the slide. I won't go through each one, but suffice it to say, there's scope to streamline the EIA section and reduce the number of articles. I'll also say that this part has been the focus of lengthy and intense negotiations during the IGC sessions. And while progress has been made on many aspects, there's still a lot on which there's still no consensus. So in particular, in this presentation, I want to deal with the much debated extent to which the EIA process should be internationalized. At the end of the third session of the IGC, the facilitator of the informal working group on EIAs highlighted that there's little convergence with respect to, and I quote, the degree to which the environmental impact assessment process should be internationalized, for example, by assigning roles to the scientific and technical body or the conference of parties, end quote. This presentation offers some thoughts on internationalization within the EIA process that the proposed activities would be subject to in the agreement and the decision-making procedure that would follow. Internationalization itself is really a multifaceted issue, and articles 24, 30, 34, 36, 37, and 38 all speak to internationalization of the EIA process in some form or fashion. So what is meant by internationalization of EIAs? Within the context of the discussion on the EIA process and decision making, I find it useful to delineate three dimensions of internationalization. The first one is internationalization of consultation, which implies really a broad global scale stakeholder notification, engagement, and public participation as it relates to consultation throughout the EIA process. The second facet of internationalization is internationalization of dissemination of information, which really refers to open distribution, circulation, and public access to information, including to the reports and decision-making documents emanating from the EIA process. And the final aspect of internationalization that I like to delineate it by is internationalization of review and decision-making, where the issue of global oversight is addressed and EIA reports are reviewed by independent experts and forwarded to an identified representative body who determines whether activities can proceed or not. Now, taken together, internationalization of consultation and internationalization of dissemination of information can ensure transparency and accountability in the EIA process and subsequent decision-making on and monitoring of activities that have effects on EBNJ. These two aspects of internationalization right now within the agreement are appearing to have broad support across most delegations. It's really the third aspect of internationalization of review and decision-making that is proven to be most contentious and where there's little convergence. So countries really wanting internationalization of review and decision-making make the argument that within the global commons, which of course ABNJ is viewed as, recognition and acknowledgement of shared interests and responsibility has important implications for decision-making. They say it shapes the understanding that it cannot be considered good governance practice to have a framework where a state is allowed to make a really unilateral decision as to whether an activity with potential to have great effect on the environment and its constituents in ABNJ. They don't want a single country making decision whether that activity may proceed or not. They further argue that to make such a decision is not the legitimate right of a singular state in an area under global custodianship. And in some, the arguments try to provoke the realization that legitimacy would better result from internationalization of review and decision-making as it relates to EIA for proposed activities in EBNJ. On the other side, countries not wanting internationalization of review and decision-making cite the interference with states' rights under UNCLOS, the existence of capable and well-functioning EIA machinery already existing within their own territories, and exorbitant costs to set up and maintain an internationalized system, including possible lengthy delays in the process of review and decision-making. They cite these as reasons why they prefer the EIA procedure remains state-controlled. So what you have is a seemingly intractable cleavage existing between countries wanting review and decision-making to be under the control of individual states and those wanting to see the process have greater global oversight. The EU, USA, Canada, and the United Kingdom are some examples of countries that have expressed sentiments aligned to the former category, which would be state-controlled EIAs, while the Caribbean community and the group of Pacific small island developing states are examples of groups and countries that want internationalization of the EIA process. Now, with a view to attaining a resolution which, in the spirit of compromise, would see the interests of states on both sides of the divide being accommodated to some degree, in a solution that is really practical and implementable. I think we need a novel approach to be put forward. And to really get compromise, you can't have, or you do not want to have all activities that impact ABNJ go into the scientific and technical body for review and the COP for decision making. If that were to happen, we may then have an overworked, non-functional scientific and technical body and an really ineffective EIA procedure on a whole. At the same time, in line with those who want internationalization, you would want to have more oversight for the proposed activities which have the potential to cause the greatest impact in areas beyond national jurisdiction. There's therefore a need to maybe tier the EIA process, and to do this, the threshold is key. A tiered approach to EIA is adopted in the Antarctic Treaty in its protocol on environmental protection. And this treaty has operationalized the threshold of minor or transitory effects in its EIA process. For the BBNJ agreement, what is being proposed here is that screening will be done under Article 30 to determine whether a project is likely to have less than a minor or transitory effect, a minor or transitory effect, or more than a minor or transitory effect. So what will happen is that if through screening it is determined that a proposed activity will have less than a minor or transitory effect, no further evaluation would be necessary and the activity can proceed. For those activities identified through screening as having a minor or transitory effect, we would then, it's proposed that we could then adopt a state-led EIA process. This means that after the EIA has been conducted, the final decision as to whether an activity proceeds or not rests with the state under whose jurisdiction or control that activity actually falls. And then finally, if screening determines that the proposed activity is likely to have more than a minor or transitory effect, the EIA process, it is proposed that the EIA process be internationalized. An internationalized EIA process would entail a review of assessment reports by the scientific and technical body and decision-making by the COP. Now, this proposed approach really hinges on what decision is arrived at through screening or during the screening process. It should be noted that the screening process will be under the control of the state, but the state must provide justification to the scientific and technical body as to how the final screening decision was arrived at. So there would be some checks and balances in place. And also, it's also important to note, as I said earlier, the threshold being used to tier the proposed BBNJ EIA approach and determine whether a proposed activity goes through a state-led decision-making or international decision-making process has come from the Antarctic Treaty. Now, since the signing of the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty, which was signed in 1991. So from 1991 to 2020, out of the hundreds of projects undertaken in the Antarctic Treaty, really only 26 projects have exceeded the threshold of more than minor or transitory effects. So based on this statistic, and depending on how well the scientific and technical body is actually resourced under the BBNJ agreement, through this proposal, we don't really foresee having an overburdened scientific and technical body, which is one of the concerns that those countries wanting a state-led EIA process had. But at the same time, it must also be acknowledged that this threshold is different from the threshold that is currently used in UNCLOS, which is found in Article 206, and that threshold is substantial pollution or significant and harmful changes to the marine environment. So the question must be asked: how does this threshold that we are proposing, which is minor transitory effects, how does that square with the UNCLOS, the current UNCLOS threshold? Persons familiar with the Antarctic Treaty have said that the threshold of more than minor transitory effects is roughly equivalent to the UNCLOS threshold of substantial pollution of or significant and harmful changes to the marine environment. So I just want to talk a bit about the role of the scientific and technical body. When screening is proposed, when screening of proposed activities determines that they're likely to have more than minor transitory effect, that's when the internationalized procedure kicks in. The scientific and technical body has a very important role in this internationalized EIA procedure, in that it will ensure that, firstly, reports adhere to the requirements of the agreement, and this includes things like content of the reports, which is found in Article 35, and the procedural requirements, such as public consultation been conducted in the manner it should be conducted as stipulated in the agreement. The scientific and technical body would also be able to assess the quality of the report and mitigation and management measures proposed. And finally, the scientific and technical body will make recommendations to the COP as to whether the activity should proceed and under what conditions. Now, internationalization of review for the most potentially harmful activity is really additionally important, because not all states have the capacity, both human and technical, to evaluate EIAs. And therefore, proposals coming out of those camps championing an entirely state-led EIA process, where assessment reports are just simply made public, and opportunities are allowed to appeal decisions made by individual states, will not really be workable for those states that lack the capacity to review and evaluate EIAs. So under this proposed way of treating with the EIA process, the scientific and technical body will act as gatekeepers in some sense for those states who don't have the capacity to evaluate and review EIAs. So this is just a schematic of what is being proposed. It should be stressed that neither camp, those calling for an entirely state-led EIA process, nor those calling for an entirely internationalized EIA process, when it comes to review and decision-making, will be entirely happy with this proposal that I've just run through. But this proposal is a form of compromise, where, if adopted, neither camp will leave negotiations feeling hard done. Additionally, I think it's a progressive proposal that improves upon the current framework for conducting EIAs in the marine environment. Over the last few days, through the seminar series, a number of speakers have told us about the need for delegations to work towards compromises in the negotiations, where we consider the interests and not the positions that are already put on the table per se. I think that what is proposed here is one such example of seeking compromise, and hopefully it will succeed in moving the negotiations forward on this EIA part of the BBNJ agreement. So thank you for listening. Before I close, I'd just like to thank the Swedish Agency of Marine and Water Management and the German Federal Ministry of Transport and Digital Infrastructure, who are sponsoring the Land to Ocean Leadership Program, under which I'm undertaking my PhD research. And I would also like to thank the One Ocean Hub for inviting me to participate in this seminar series. I'm of course open to any questions that you all may have, and if anyone wants to have follow-up discussions with me, my email address can be found on the slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khalil, for that quite comprehensive and interesting presentation. I will now invite Tanya to give her comments and ask questions on Khalil's presentation. And yes, so Tanya.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Khalil, thank you so much for that presentation. I found it so interesting. My name is Tanya Wagner. I'm a lecturer at the Faculty of Law at Nelson Mandela University in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. So Khalil, I just have a couple of questions very briefly. Firstly, with regard to the relationship between the BBNJ agreement and other EIA processes, I know that EIA in ABNJ has traditionally been sectorally specific, with EIA only required for specific activities. And a reading of the draft articles as they stand at the moment doesn't really seem to make it clear whether the EIA provisions will apply to all activities affecting BBNJ or just to those activities involving MGRs or marine genetic resources, since this is the only form of or biodiversity related resource that has actually been defined. For instance, draft Article 23, paragraph 4, option 1 provides that the global, regional, and sectoral bodies with a mandate in relation to BBNJ must conform, to the EIA provisions, or at least to the standards set out in the BBNJ agreement, while Article 23, paragraph 4, option 2 provides that an EIA will not be required for activities conducted in terms of those global, regional, and sectoral bodies. So it seems as if there's the road to consensus is still quite long. So I just wanted to know what your views are regarding the extent to which, the proposed EIA provisions are going to apply to all activities which have an impact on BBNJ, or is it just those to which, the definitions within the BBNJ will apply? So is it also going to be a activity-specific process? And then related to that, I just wanted to ask what your views are on the inclusion of fish caught as a commodity. While I think it's unlikely that it will be included, we know that there's quite a few of the parties within the various negotiating blocks that are still pushing for fishing or fish caught as a commodity to be included within the ambit of the definition of marine genetic resources. And I was just curious to know what you would think about how would the EIA provisions that you've discussed, how would that then be applicable to an activity such as fishing, considering it's very impractical to think about a commercial fishing, before a commercial fishing expedition, the guys having to conduct environmental impact assessments. And then my last thing is just a comment, not so much a question, regarding strategic environmental assessments, which is provided for by draft Article 28. It's generally accepted that strategic environmental assessments, or SEAs, is a different form of assessment. So under the banner of impact assessments, you'll have environmental impact assessments and strategic environmental assessments, so EIAs and SEAs. Yet Part 4 of the draft BBNJ agreement is entitled environmental impact assessments, which then seems to include SEAs, would it not then be more appropriate to sort of have part 4 named impact assessments? And then within that part, you could then have the processes which apply to the various types of impact assessments, such as EIAs and SEAs, that they might want to try and govern or regulate. So if I could just get some, I was just interested in your thoughts on some of those queries.
Thanks, Tanya. Yeah, very interesting questions. So the first question that you had on with talking about different impact assessment procedures under different bodies. It is true that there are a few bodies out there who already have mandates to conduct environmental impact assessments in areas beyond national jurisdiction, and it's still very much under debate what would be the relationship with these bodies who already have mandates and the new BBNJ agreement. You rightly highlighted Article 23, which I think gets to the root of these issues. But Article 23, as you rightly highlighted, it's still bracketed, and it's still there's still options available under Article 23. I think the what I would like to see personally is that those bodies or entities or agencies who already have a mandate to conduct EIAs under their own arrangements, they should not have to have 2 EIAs being done or another EIA being done under the BBNJ agreement itself, as long as the EIAs that they conduct under their ambit is substantively equivalent to one required under the BBNJ agreement. And what you need to have is just a conversation between the scientific and technical body of the BBNJ agreement and those other arrangements to see that the EIA is conducted are substantively equivalent and meet the requirements of the BBNJ agreement. With regard to the question on fish, fishing, you're quite right. Having fishing, every fishing boat going out there having to conduct an EIA is obviously impractical. But I think fishing can be captured under, so there are 2 things. If a fishing fleet were to propose to introduce a new type of fishing method or a new type of fishing gear, I think we could subject that to an EIA and see how this new method or this new type of fishing gear would impact in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And then we can move forward after that. I think fishing can also be captured under, and you raised the point about strategic environmental assessment. Different people and different countries see strategic environmental assessment in different ways. But if you see strategic environmental assessment as assessing the vulnerability of areas beyond national jurisdiction to a range of activities and identifying where the most vulnerable areas are, and then partitioning where activities should occur and where they shouldn't occur. I think we can deal with fishing under strategic environmental assessments so that they avoid vulnerable areas and as such. And your last question was on, or statement was on strategic environmental assessments. SCAs they fall under the EIA part of the agreement, and they have their own specific article. It's probably that's a good suggestion that you have with regard to renaming the part 4 impact assessment, so it captures everything, the strategic and the environmental. That's a suggestion that we can probably think about and see if it finds favor with delegations that are negotiating. I would also say that strategic environmental assessment is the way to bridge the area-based management tools part of the agreement and the EIA part of the agreement. SEA is a very useful tool to do that, and it's still under the agreement. We're not sure as yet how SEAs will be operationalized, and it's very likely that operationalizing SEAs would only become that will be developed later down the road by the COP and the scientific and technical body, but it's something that we need to have within the BBNJ agreement itself. It's definitely something that needs to be included, but further thought needs to be given on how to actually operationalize SEAs under the BBNJ agreement. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, you have perfectly. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Tanya and Khalil, for that rich discourse. I'd like to introduce the last presenter on today's panel, last but certainly not least, Dr. Zaki Mubarak Buruso, a research fellow at the Center of Sustainable Ocean Policy at the University of Indonesia. And he will be presenting on capacity building technologies transferred under the proposed BBNJ, and he will be followed by his discussant, Dr. Bolani Erinoso of the University of Cape Coast. So, Zaki?
Thank you, Alana. Good evening for everyone. It is 8 o'clock from Indonesia. So I'm glad to share the forum with all of you. My name is Zaki Mubarak Busro. Just call me Zaki. I'm from Indonesia and research fellow Center for Sustainable Ocean Policy, Universitas Indonesia or University of Indonesia, the same university as Senia. All right. It is a very important forum. I'd like to present a slide, a presentation with regard to capacity building and marine technology transfer in biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. Would like to offer this the discussion whether it is voluntary or mandatory, or it is voluntary and mandatory. It will be very interesting discussion to come. Here I have at least 3 main objectives in sharing my insights about this particular issue. First of all, I would like to, hopefully I can raise awareness about the importance of this topic, in particular technology transfer and capacity building. And secondly, I hope I can offer some insights on the issue. And thirdly, I will offer some discussions with regard to the issue. It is undoubtedly that BBNJ agreement, of course, offers a historic opportunity to strengthen the international framework, including capacity building and technology transfer, in particular to support the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity. During the negotiation of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, the delegates focused 4 main issues, as we may aware, including this topic, capacity building and technology transfer, and mostly their main concern was about fulfilling their rights and responsibilities with regard to this issue. We can see from Article 42 of draft BBNJ agreement, the delegates came into discussion that it is important to develop marine scientific and technological capacity, and also increasing and also disseminating and sharing knowledge with regard to the conservation and sustainable use of BBNJ. In Article 46 of the draft, the delegates came into a discussion that capacity building and transfer of technology should take place at all levels and in several forms, including sharing of data, information and knowledge, infrastructure, and also human resources. We can see also Article 44, 45, and 46 of the draft. They emphasize on the importance of cooperation as pivotal to achieve capacity building and technology transfer in BBNJ. However, there were divergent views with regard to this topic. Should it be mandatory, or should it be voluntary, or should it be mandatory and voluntary? I will come into deeper discussion with regard to this particular topic. It is important also to note that SDG 14A, it touches upon the development of research capacity and transfer of marine technology, taking into account specifically the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission's criteria and guidelines on the transfer of marine technology. So primarily, Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission has set up a criteria and guidelines on the transfer of marine technology. In particular, interest to developing countries, seeds, small island developing states, and also less developed countries. Next slide, please. Thanks, Anya. Before going further, I'd like to touch upon the regulation or the arrangement of marine technology transfer and capacity building under United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. There are two main parts. First part is part 13 and second part is part 14 of UNCLOS. Part 14 of UNCLOS covers development and transfer of marine technology specifically, and there are some articles that we can refer on. Article 202 covers scientific and technical assistance to developing states. And Article 242, in brief, it covers promotion of international cooperation. 244 with regard to publication and dissemination of information knowledge. And then Article 266 with regard to cooperation and development. Article 268 with regard to the state's role to develop marine technology, either directly or through international organizations with particular interest to developing states and less developed states at all levels. Article 266 and Article 274, they cover measures to achieve technical cooperation. Agreements, seminars, exchange of scientists is very, 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 very detailed. The last Article 270, it covers ways and means of international cooperation. Next slide. Thanks. There are some discussion that we have to address on. In terms of capacity building in BBNJ agreement, what kind of forms of scientific and technological that will be covered in this BBNJ agreement? We have to have an overview. We have to observe that when we discuss about environmental impact assessment, it is connected to scientific capacity. When we talk about access and use of marine genetic resources, it needs scientific capacity as well. So it is interlinked. We have to make it comprehensive, interlinked between those issues, between those four main issues of BBNJ. It is also important to set up or to agree that capacity building should cover at all levels, from global to region to sub-region and to local, as stipulated in UNCLOS provisions. We have problem with regard to capacity building. We have problem with the uneven spread of scientific capacity worldwide. That's why it is very important to give or to render or to provide capacity building and transfer of marine technology to developing countries. Indonesia, we have many problems with our capacity to explore marine genetic resources, for example, in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And that's why we need assistance, we need capacity building from developing countries, from developed countries. Third, the roles of scientific and technical body has been stipulated under the draft text BBNJ agreement. Even though it is the body deals primarily science and technical matters, but it also has the role to assess the effectiveness of the implementation of measures and programs for capacity building and the transfer of marine technology, including whether capacity gaps are decreasing. So this is very important. So not only we do the capacity building program, we do the transfer of marine technology program or project. This scientific and technical body has very important role to measure if the capacity gaps exist, and it will be very important for states to discuss and to address the issue. With regard to the clearinghouse mechanism, there are several related issues dealing with the capacity building and a transfer of marine technology. Primarily, this mechanism, this clearinghouse mechanism, is a center to access and exchange information on activities related to biodiversity and ABNG. And also, this clearinghouse mechanism has an important role to promote international collaboration or cooperation. And thirdly, with regard to technology transfer, it has the role to facilitate by improving the linkages between technology recipients and donors, and also enabling knowledge exchange between countries. Next. Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission under UNESCO has set up criteria and guidelines on transfer of marine technology, and it is a response to Article 271 of UNCLOS. There are four main pillars for technology transfer. Firstly, data, with regard to data, information, and knowledge. Secondly, about people. Thirdly, about tools, about equipment. Fourthly, it is related to cooperation and collaboration. What about draft text BBNJ agreement? To the best of my knowledge, it covers even more comprehensive. It is more comprehensive than what has been stated or regulated under the guidelines or criteria of IOC. This I'd like to present challenges when we come into discussion on this particular topic. We have problem with the vast area and volume of marine under in areas with national jurisdiction. It is very complex and costly logistics, as we know, and even if it is in remote locations, it will come into more complication, and then it requires, of course, a collaborative approach. We also aware that we are aware that there is a vast area of unknown biodiversity of a deep sea and RSP national jurisdiction. We have also problem with the funding for research and also limited access to materials and data. And then next is the lack of mechanism to support the strong emphasis on science cooperation to deliver marine technology transfer. Where what we are facing this problem now, and there also we are facing a problem that there is no common mechanism to request technology or capacity building. And there is no clear practical arrangement exist to deliver marine technology transfer, to monitor and evaluate progress toward capacity building. And also we have problem currently with a lack of information, and it promotes a further critical challenge to design, implement, and evaluate capacity building and transfer technology programs, and even more marine scientific research programs more broadly. Next. We have challenges, but we have opportunities. In several ways, BBNJ agreement, we should believe that it could strengthen cooperation and coordination of marine scientific research, technology transfer, and capacity building activities. The BBNJ instrument could provide institutional clarity and promote institutional support for international cooperation and coordination. It also enable the identification and communication of capacity building needs. And this agreement could include measures that better enable actors, individual to institutional skills, to access and utilize science and technology in order to participate in the implementation of agreement. From the perspective of research, scientific research, it presents opportunity to deliver on technology transfer and build capacity at multiple scales. Here we, in this topic, in this particular point, it can boost institutional capacity in less developed states or regions for better cooperation mechanism. And then as such, this opportunity requires a paradigm shift from merely capacity building as a training initiative to not only a training initiative and bilateral hardware donation, but it should all offers opportunities to as a strategy to boost science collaboration or cooperation. Next. I will conclude my presentation by offering some discussions on draft text on BBNJ. First of all, in draft text on BBNJ, main part of capacity building and transfer of marine technology is on part 5. The question is should it be voluntary or mandatory, or voluntary and mandatory? Third, I observed that the discussion, I mean, the arrangement should not duplicate to the existing programs, and it should strengthen the existing mechanism. We can see that during the negotiation, IOC offers their willingness to support member states in a BBNG process by offering global, by offering the institution as a center for global data sharing platform, and also a mechanism for international cooperation in marine scientific research, coordination in global ocean observation. And also they offer the institution as global network for regional centers to enhance capacity. So they offer that kind of those three main activities that we can observe and put it in BBNJ agreement. I also would like to discuss that the particular attention to developing states. We have the problem with regard to this to explore the BBNJ biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, and uh, there is an interesting discussion during a BBNJ negotiation. If it is important to include archipelagic states in a proposed articles, for example, Article 43 and Article 41, paragraph 5. Wait, okay, hold on. They, for example, Article 43, there are the cooperation of the state parties shall give full recognition to the special requirement developing state parties, in particular less developed countries, landlocked and geographically disadvantaged states, small island developing states, and some delegates propose archipelagic states in this article, because they also refer to coastal African states and developing middle income countries. And for Article 51, clearinghouse mechanism, the mechanism shall recognize the special circumstances, not only for small island developing state parties, and also archipelagic developing state parties. So here it is very interesting to discuss as well. And wait, what is the last one? I cannot see. Hold on. The last one is types of capacity building and transfer of marine technology. If we want to compare between UNCLOS and the draft text, what forms of capacity building and transfer of marine technology in draft text, if those mirror UNCLOS provision or not? And to the best of my knowledge, even in the draft text, it is more comprehensive than UNCLOS. With regard to the voluntary, mandatory, or voluntary and mandatory, in my personal observation, it should be voluntary and mandatory. Not only, it is not a choice of either voluntary or mandatory, but in my personal perspective, it should cover both voluntary and mandatory, because for voluntary, to the at some stage, marine transfer of marine technology and capacity building, it brings what is it, like intellectual property rights. So I think it cannot be mandatory for that kind of particular topic. I think that's my last presentation. I'd like to seek your view, your opinion, question, anything. Thank you, Alana. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Zaki, for actually quite an excellent presentation. I like how you did the challenges and then you looked at the opportunities and offered some thoughts. So a bit of gloom, but then you gave us the silver lining. I'd like to invite uh, Bola to give her comments and questions on your discussion, and then we can wrap up.
Thank you, Alana. Thank you, Dr. Zaki Mubarak. That was a very interesting presentation. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. So although I had quite a few questions, and I'm sure the audience as well do, we may have to leave them to be answered later on. One quick question I'd just like to highlight. As you rightly stated, UNCLOS, including Article 266, talks about protecting the development of marine science technology transfer on an equitable basis. Now, my key question is around the concept of equitable basis in transfer of technology and capacity. In particular, I'm looking at questions like the impacts on indigenous peoples and small-scale fishing communities, for example. In view of the fact that the BBNJ, the draft treaty, etc., is a global to local framework, and experience has shown us that with those kinds of systems, often the local is excluded. What are your thoughts around ensuring that in this concept of equitable transfer, we do not exclude the communities at the local level, which are particularly vulnerable?
So you have 3 questions or 1 question?
Well, just one, as you know, as you can summarize it in one very brief answer, I think, because we haven't got too much time.
Yeah, because I'm confused. Yeah. So what is the main question? Because your question is about Article 266 and indigenous people and global, local levels.
Yes, so the question is, with the BBNJ negotiations being a primarily global affair, there is often the tendency to ignore the concerns of those who are at the local level. So that's why I use the examples of the indigenous communities as well as perhaps small-scale fishers. So I'm asking what your thoughts are on how the BBNJ treaty or the negotiations can ensure that those communities are well represented within the treaty system.
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, we should refer to the CBD convention. It covers the role of indigenous people, and as part of a negotiating team of Indonesia. But here I'm not representing Indonesia. I work for Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, but yeah, as a scientist, I there should be a strong foundation or argument that the role of indigenous people in a BNG or BBNG negotiation should not be ignored. Because if we have a look, for example, Indonesia, we have a lot of ethnic groups, and they also part of indigenous people and also local communities. So I strongly argue that the state party should include what is it? the role of indigenous people and local communities in the agreement. Because, for example, indigenous people, for Indonesia fishermen, for example, Indonesian fishermen, even though they are traditional, and some of them are traditional, for example, in terms of vessel, for example, but they can go to high seas. They, they, their ship is only, for example, 5 meters, but they can go to high seas. And there are some what is it uh, they have what they call as marine culture uh, between Indonesia and Australia. They used to go to Australia before before the maritime boundaries was concluded between Indonesia and Australia. So we have to acknowledge and include indigenous people and local communities to be part of this negotiation. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Over to Alana.
Thank you, Zaki and Bola. And unfortunately, we have run out of time. I myself have so many questions, I guess the time has been too short and the discussion rich. And perhaps this is an indication, Senya, that we need to have perhaps a follow up in the new year on this topic. Uh, yeah, so I'd like to just thank our audience as well as our presenters and also our support team from the University of Strathclyde and the One Ocean Hub. And I'd like to wish everyone a good morning, be it morning, evening, or afternoon, wherever you are. And we look forward to seeing you in future webinars. Thank you.